and different insects that have stages that they are doing that. So yeah, we're going to talk about managing vegetable pests tonight. And see, I got all this ton of information I was putting on all these slides before you tonight. But no, so and I'm going to simplify that into a handout I'll give you next week. This kind of information that makes sense on a garden scale. But asparagus, this is the time to plant it. And we just need to make enough space per plant. That's why I'm going to convert it to space per plant, because how many asparagus do you want to plant? But how many of you planted asparagus before? So what you want to do is make your trough like 6 to 8 inches deep, depending on your soil type. And then in the bottom of the trough, you just put in some phosphate. You know, so you know, so like start with low nitrogen and phosphate in the bottom, and you put some soil on top of that, so the crown is not placed right on top of that. And then you just bury the crown at 2 to 3 inches. Is this what you two guys did? Yay or nay? And then what you do is you keep covering and filling in that trough as the plant grows, so that the crown is going to end up being 5 to 7 inches below the soil surface. And then as it gets established, you can harvest those spears in the spring of the year until about middle of next month. But so that's.
So if you don't put them that deep, are they smaller then?
Well, I actually had a master gardener that grew up in France and moved to this country, and they want to have big stem spears that they harvest. So they plant them very deep. It depends on your soil type. If it's the same soil, you can go a little deeper than it's a loam soil. It may be only 5 to 6 inches deep on a good loam soil. And then the hybrids, you can go a little bit deeper because they have a little bigger. But underneath that, you use a starter fertilizer to get them off to a good start so they get established. And then, that can change the diameter. And of course, we stop harvesting each year when the diameter gets smaller, and we don't harvest the part until the plant gets well established. That's the trick to asparagus.
Why? How is it that you can't just plant it deep to begin with?
Well, and cover it over, because you want to keep the oxygen getting to that crown as that initial growth is occurring.
For it to grow.
Yes, so that's why we're doing that. So then we're allowing that plant to get established before we bury it initially, that part, and covering it completely with the soil. That's the concept. Now we want to keep air to those roots, because we always want to remember roots need air and moisture. So instead of me just fumbling along, ask me 10 questions that I can talk about tonight, and I'll start there.
Okay, what about the little, since I mentioned the kale. Kale comes really good for me, and then all of a sudden, about the time that I want to really start harvesting it, it's full of holes and little worms on the back, on the underside of the leaves that have been eating holes in them. Are those from those, what we used to call cabbage millers, the little butterfly kind of thing? Laying their eggs, is that what?
Yeah, let me go over the paths of
The arugula tends to be resistant to them, at least at the beginning, but not the kale.
okay, yeah, because yeah, so we have all these critters that are you know, if you're getting holes, it's usually something that has a chewing mouth part, so that usually tend to be some type of a caterpillar, unless it's but it has to be an insect that has a chewing part. Yeah. You know, so we have, like diamondback caterpillars that impact a lot of the coal crops that we grow that, you know, in case of broccoli, you want to do something that's 10% infected, or the cabbage worm and loper caterpillars at 10% infected, because they're attacking what you want. They're getting into that broccoli flower. Now, they're just stem feeders. We wouldn't worry as much, but because of where they're feeding. So we get worried about more on cabbage when it's at 50% of the crops are getting impacted by those. So they're going to be chewing some holes in what we're growing. And then you look at things like, you know, we have slugs that will feed on stuff, but they're, you can see their slimy trail, and they're feeding differently than what, again, a caterpillar will. Again, aphids is that insect I was talking about that has a sucking mouth part that's pulling nutrients out of the plant. So you need a lot of those to really impact the plant. A few is not any problem. We don't worry about a few aphids.
What's effective against the little worms that eat?
In these, if it's in the caterpillar family, we have BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, that you put it on there, and it controls the first instar of that larva. It gets in their gut where they can't feed. So it's the thing that made the headlines, because we incorporated it into field corn, and we're worried about the larva of some butterflies being impacted in the corn plant. But the larvae we tend to go after are the ones that are feeding on the corn plant where it gets in. But we do it as an organic control by just buying it. It has to be for the right type of insect. Colorado potato beetle, we use BT, that's for beetles. And for members of the Doctor family, the larvae of moths and butterflies, we use one geared towards them. And it was the natural control that we, you know, that we use to control that first instar. So it's something you can put on your crops, but you gotta do it early. And then the other thing I like, and with potatoes, the BT for Colorado potato beetle, along with straw mulch, is as good of control as any commercial insecticide, because the commercial insecticides that insect develops resistance to. And that resistance is so common in that insect that the ones they use in the commercial industry, they won't let homeowners get anymore. And Southern Indiana, I had a person call me up once and told me they use this really strong insecticide that's not for vegetables or fruit crops at all. It's for ornamental plants only. And then they asked me, can I eat my potatoes? I go, well, your guess is as good as mine, because we did not do the research on that chemical to know if it's safe to eat the potatoes. So legally, I said, I can't give you a nod that that's okay, because what you put in that plant could end up in that tuber. So that BT is something we can use on this. So we just need to know what for sure is eating the hole in there.
But there's nothing like, there's no broad spectrum kind of, like some things that seem that they've worked for me a little bit in the past. I mean, I don't grow such volume that I can't bend down and spray underneath the leaves and on with a little, you know.
Well,
And so I've used like the soap, that kind of insecticidal soap, or neem oil, and then it rains, so you have to go over again.
Like this.
well, you can use the classic organic method. You have two blocks, and you put a target on both of the blocks, and then you put the insect in between, and you go like that. But the BT is actually better, because you're putting something out there that takes out the first instar. So as soon as they hatch out, it's that first instar that's feeding on the plant will help control them, if that's the insect that's doing it. And so we need to identify the insect to know for sure that the BT is going to work, but it doesn't cost that much. So that could be a component along with your contact insecticide, because you need to get that right on them for it to work. You know, that's how it works. Like insecticidal soap, they have all those holes in their body and stuff, and you're just clogging it up so they suffocate. You know, diatomaceous earth is actually like you're putting tiny knives all over the plant. So as they're crawling with their soft bodies, you're cutting them. So that's how it controls them.
Is that a very good, a fairly useful thing, spreading the diatomaceous earth around?
If you're trying to kill a soft-bodied insect, it has to be a larva form of an insect for it to work. It's not going to work on like stink bugs, which can feed on other pests because it has proboscis that goes right into your fruit. Like the marmorated stink bug is a particular problem these days because it's feeding on our fruits of many plants, including some of our vegetables, you know, so wherever it puts its proboscis into that fruit, there's going to be an area that's impacted. So we can't get that nice apple, or it can impact tomatoes and other vegetable fruits too, because it's a fairly, like the Japanese beetle, a broad spectrum feeder. And Japanese beetle is problematic because they will feed on a broad spectrum of things like grapes, you know, so you're growing grapes and some of those plants. Or if you're, and I know you're not growing sweet corn, but Japanese beetles and then the adult form of the corn rootworm feed on silks. So if you have too many of those on your sweet corn, they never pollinate because there's no silk. We got to have silk that's at least, you know, a couple inches away from the husk for it to collect the pollen and effectively do fertility to the kernel it's attached to. Okay. So, you know, because that sweet corn, that's why they sometimes they're so odd shapen, it's because, you know, those silks grow and then from the bottom up, and then as those silks are pollinating the kernels, they synapse. But as they're growing, they have that short period to get the pollen, and if something's feeding on those silks, you can have very poor pollination. So then they get that year that it looks like it just has a few kernels all over it. So in that case, you know, that can be a real challenge to control those. And we always think of that being a pest of the roots of the plant. But BT is just one I like because we can use it in multiple places and it's not something that hurts us. So we don't have to worry about it. Diatomaceous earth, we don't want to take that in our noses or anything like that. So you'd have to be careful with the application because it's ground up like calcium stuff is what it is. So we don't want to be getting into our system as well. Good question. So, you know, and, you know, so when we're talking about cover crops, if you're growing broccoli, there's a pest that you can attract to your spot by growing if you're using a cover crop that has a cole crop in it, you know, because then you get them established before you plant your whatever cabbage. I mean, what's amazing really about this whole family is, you know, we talk about engineer, you know, GMOs, genetically modified organisms. That's what cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, all these, they all started from an initial plant that we selected to go different routes and create different plants we use. So that's why, you know, talking about coal, I mean, I just from here on out just said same pests, because they're that closely related genetically that they have some of the same problems. It just like it depends on what we're harvesting, is at what level we're going to start treating some of these caterpillars. And some of these insects, you can just tell by their damage. Again, flea beetles are scratching just like the thrips are, so you can see their damage. And that's the main pest of what I don't know. How many of you like eggplant? So if you're growing it, that's one of our major pests of eggplants because it gets on the fruit and it's damaging the fruit as it's developing. So insects can be a real problem. How many of you like to grow, you know, so we have these weird insects. So how many of you have heard of the squash bug? My son did this great thing last year. He had some a pumpkin from the previous year's seed that germinated. So he grew his 2 little pumpkins. But the reason why this is such a problematic pest of pumpkins and other winter squashes is because the squash bug, or literally, again, it's a bug. So just like that stink bug, it's poking into the fruit to harvest its nutrients. So it's damaging where the plant's attached to the vine, and it's damaging the plant itself. So you may get a fruit, but it's not going to be one that you can store and keep. When I was in college at Purdue, I had this pumpkin that lasted all the way into February. I just decorated it differently. You know, originally it was the October thing, then it was a Christmas pumpkin, and then there's the New Year's pumpkin. And it stayed good that whole period. And that's because this insect cannot feed upon it. So this is one, again, another insect. How do we control it? Do we wait and get even with it, or do we control it as soon as we start seeing it? This is one you want to start rapidly if you see it, because they'll multiply. Insects have this ability to reproduce that is just amazing. So if I had 2 flies, which are out now, and they mate today, and they have nothing that restrains their genetic potential. They got all the food they need, and their offspring have all the food they need. In 1 year, how big a mass would that produce of flies? The size of our globe, our Earth. Seriously. So if, you know, because it just goes, you know, at a logarithm scale, because, you know, it's not just them having babies, their babies are having babies, they reproduce so fast, you know, and that's why Mother Nature is controlling our insect population. And the other insect that shows that it's not healthy, that can get out of whack, is the armyworm, or the fall armyworm last year. You know, so we had this insect that came up from the south, and it flew in with a storm, and it reproduced rapidly, and it took out alfalfa fields, and cost us a lot of money there. And then fall armyworms like grasses, so they took out people's turf, but hopefully most of that came back. But armyworms, literally, I was in southern Indiana, we had them real bad, and I didn't know anything like to eat fescue. I mean, if you ever chewed on pasture type Kentucky 31 fescue, the broadwood, and the pubescence on it makes it really gritty in your mouth. It almost hurts. And cattle will eat it. My sheep don't like it that much, but the armyworms do. And they just went across pastures and took the first cut in, and then they go across the road. So that is a year when that happened, because biological control didn't work. It was a really dry spring, so we didn't have as many beneficial insects, nor did we have the diseases that usually took them out. You know, so that was just a unique thing. So what we're mimicking organically is trying to create some of these situations that Mother Nature does to manage them. You know,
I've been reading lately that our insect population has just kind of nosedived over the last 10, 15 years, to where the amount of insects by volume now are not anywhere near what they once were. And people give various reasons for that. I ran across an odd one the other day. I'd never heard of it before, but does that mean that doesn't sound though from what you're saying, like the pest type insects are lessening in quantity and the damage they can do to crops? It must be beneficial ones that are going away.
well, 90% of the insects are just neutral. We don't, I don't talk about them because they're not pests. You know, but it's only a small percent of insects that we act, or nematodes is that one second worm that cause real problems to us, and just based upon their food preferences. Japanese beetle gets her day, in the spotlight because she eats such a wide range of plants. And then her larvae feed on our turf, the roots, because we have other grubs that live in our soil that feed on decaying organic matter more than they feed on living roots. So they're not near the problem that that grub is. Then we have the Asiatic garden beetle that is making us upset because it lives under debris during the day, like the cutworm. You don't see them during the day, and then they come out at night. And the Asiatic garden beetle will rip your flowers apart, their leaves and stuff. And it can be mind-boggling because you don't see them during the day. What is doing this? Well, you have to come out at night to see it. And then again, like the tomato hornworm, if you catch it at an early instart, it's worth controlling. But when you see the really big ones, we notice them because they're eating more because they're about ready to pupate and fall to the soil and go into being a pupa and come out as a sphinx moth. So the moth of that insect flies like a hummingbird. It's not the cool looking ones because their wings are opaque, so they're not clear winged snake moths that actually do almost look like hummingbirds when they're flying around. But, so it's controlling it at the right stage too. And so biological control, if I see one a hornworm that has those white cocoons on its back, you take it home and you put it on your plant because those are parasitic wasps and they'll come out and they'll lay eggs on other larvae that are feeding on your plants. And I always say nature is a very gruesome, because what is killing that larvae? It's the larvae of the parasitic wasp that's feeding on the inside of that insect, and it comes out to make that cocoon on top of its back. And I did a research at a event where I had two tomato plants. I had a healthy one on this one and this one that had the white cocoons on their back, in the pupa form. And the one that had the white cocoons on it was not eating anything of that tomato plant because it was sick. It didn't feel good. While the other one was voraciously eating my tomato plant. And that one was vanishing over that 3-day period and the other one was not. But then when those flies will come out, that healthy one, they'll lay eggs on it, or more importantly, maybe the smaller ones that'll be on that plant. But the hornworms, we see them usually when the damage is mostly done, they kind of blend in at the smaller stages with our plants. So that's where being observant can help out, because you can pick those off usually and not have to use an insecticide if you're just being observant, if you only have a few tomato plants. It's just because you'll notice the damage if you're paying attention. But what do we do as gardeners? We're too busy in life. We plant a tomato plant, and then tomato plants is a good example because I have this tomato plant here. And it's got these leaves down here and up here. We usually grow indeterminate tomato plants. If you're going to do canning, you grow the determinate kinds that all mature at the same time. So you have a lot of tomatoes ready to do canning. You don't have to, wait them all to get mature at different times. So we do the interdeterminate. So we have all this healthy new growth up here that's producing new leaves, new flowers, and the foliage down deep, we're not paying much attention to. So if we have an insect feeding down here, if we're not really looking, we don't see them. If we have this lower leaf that's changing color, we don't notice it. And that's the leaf we should be pulling, so it's not producing spores to spread through the whole tomato plant. So
if you just see one turning yellow on the bottom, that doesn't mean your whole plant is gone then, huh?
if you see, when people call me, this is what the scenario is. This third is already basically dead. This third is starting to show the disease. And then this third already looks healthy. But diseases usually take 7 to 14 days before you see the initial lesion, because a spore is like a seed planted into the leaf, tissue. And when it's originally planted, you don't see it until it gets established in that leaf. And when it's established, you'll notice some discoloration, and depending on whether it's a bacteria disease or a fungal disease, because bacteria is more aggressive disease than what fungal diseases are, and tomatoes have got both. We got bacterial spot, bacterial canker, that gets on the fruit and the plant. So that one we want to definitely stop quickly. But then we have several fungal diseases. Late blight is the worst one, because that organism they don't have resistance to. So it's what devastated us a couple of years ago, because it was introduced to our box stores on transplants coming from the southern states. So that organism cannot live over our winters here, that fungus that creates that disease. And so the only way it overwintered here was on tubers of potatoes that were still in the soil, that were diseased but not harvested. So then that was the source of the disease the following year. But so that one we don't want. We shouldn't get, because it doesn't overwinter here. So that's the good news about that one. But so we don't notice it, and it's down here. So when I get the phone call, ask me what I can do. I said, well, next year, this lower part of this plant, it'll produce, leaf tissue. Then it'll try and grow a branch from the bottom. Those we remove, just so that down here where the diseases usually get started, we have more air movement. We don't have a tomato plant right here. We try to have that tomato plant far enough away that we have air movement and row spacing so they get good air movement. So even if I do, like, I'm just planting into a well-developed soil bed, I'm still going to plant them where they're not going to grow a lot together. I want that space between them so they have good air movement. I pull those to increase that. I will sterilize anything I used from the previous year, a cage, for example, so that, because that disease can overwinter on that stuff. So we should do a good job of anything we use for gardening, that we just clean thoroughly with a 10% bleach solution, so it's not carrying over to the next year. I had a grower once in southern Indiana that started had a bedding plant industry. And let me ask you, if you find a place you like to go to buy bedding plants, do you just go there the next year? So he had already been doing this for a while, but he thought he had saved some money. So he reused his trays and flats from the previous year, but he didn't disinfect them. So we have a disease called dampening off. So when you have your young plant growing, if that disease organism is there, it takes out that stem and it just falls over and dies. So his whole crop died before so the only way he survived at all is he started buying bedding plants from another source and just reselling them versus what he grew. Why? Because he did not disinfect the stuff that he had that he needed to disinfect to control disease. And that's why when you go to the box stores to buy a mix, don't buy the bags that are broken open and have things growing out of them, because that has disease in it. You get picky, and it's kind of like, I want a bag that is still sealed, so it has nothing in it other than what was delivered with it, because I used to make soilless mix for the Napanee greenhouse. I no longer exist because I'm so old, but what we used was steam. So my job was to dig soil and fill a wagon and put our fire hose with a manifold on it and steam that soil and put it into a storage area. And then we had muck soil that I steamed to use as well. Then we bought perlite, an aerator for the soil, and we bought peat. And it was 1 scoop of each that I ground together to make all the bedding soil that business used at the time, that we used steam. And in between crops, we steamed our crops. So I used steam to sterilize things. So we didn't use chemical sterilant, we just used good old steam.
How did you steam it?
Just had this big metal pipe, pipe that went out like this, and then a manifold. So I connected the boiler steam to the top of the manifold, and I had fire hose that connected to the pipes. and they were tied off at the end, and you just ran them out the length of the bed, and then the steam just came out of that into the beds where we grew flowers, and for the wagons I brought in, I with shorter holes that I put down there and steam those before I put it in the storage area to make the bed. Because if any disease organ there, that can get spread. And I already told you previously that how we do this in garden soils is building the health of the soil so we have active organic matter so that the biology, the microorganisms are the ones that do good for our plants versus the ones that attack our plants. So, that's one way that we do disease control organically, building soil health in the soil. And they do research on this at Purdue University, and what they found out is, yeah, it's not as simple as what I said. The research has shown that it does help plants to better resist introduction of disease organisms. And they're researching different soil amendments they can use to see how they work on that soil biology.
We all need someone like you to do that for us.
Create that soil, perfect soil for you, you mean? That's really not complicated. It's compost.
Yeah, it's cover crops, but you have to use the right cover crop, because you use the wrong one, that could set you up for problems with the crop you grow after
That's
it.
not the steam part.
Oh, the steam part, we just don't use steam, we don't use fuel oil and boilers anymore. That was back in the days when heat was cheap, because fuel was cheap relative to the cost. And farmers used to think nitrogen was cheap, but nitrogen costs about 3 to 4 times more than last year, which already was much higher than when I started extension. I used to be able to tell you how to grow corn per acre. I just ask you, how many bushels do you want to raise? 200. Well, you take that times 1.25, so it's 200 and a quarter, so that's about 250 pounds of nitrogen you need to apply. Because our goal when I started extension was to make sure that we didn't run out of nitrogen. So we always applied so much that we would, even what was wasted. But what I learned today, this is not on vegetable production, I'm sorry, but they're going to talk about the waters of the state, and they're starting to discuss, they're going to make it illegal to do what farmers used to do a lot of in southern Indiana when I started. So it's applied nitrogen, because a lot of that would leach and go into our surface water. So that practice is probably going to be history unless you got an actively growing crop. So it's going to be another tool that they can use again to grow cover crops, because that will pull the nutrients out. Back to pest and our vegetable crop, it's really starts with observation. Because the critical thing for the health of the plant is to observe anything other than normal plant behavior in its growth pattern. So I bought 2 nice tomato plants at the farmer's market. I know the grower. They're organic growers. So it doesn't have osmocote in the medium that your tomato plants in. So there's no inherent way for that soil to provide nutrients to my plant as they get washed out with water. So I saw nutrient deficiency showing up in my transplant pretty quickly. So what do I need to do? Then I have to get it into a new soil that has nutrients to grow that tomato plant to keep it healthy. So your window of plant health can be pretty small if you're a procrastinator, because in that case, that transplant needs to be planted more rapidly than other transplants, because I have another seller there that he uses soilless mix that has osmocote, which is just little pellets that have nitrogen in it. The nutrients that as you water it, some of them release the nutrients. So usually that media is good with fertility for 6 months. Well, if I'm using compost created soilless mix to grow my transplants in, it has a shelf life much shorter. And knowing those details will know how to manage your transplants and get them going. So that transplant needed to be planted the day that I bought it into my garden space. that already created a rich soil, so it's getting the nutrients it needs, so it takes off. You know, so that's how we keep soil health going in the right direction, the plant health going in the right direction. And then as it grows, I need to support that plant so it stays vertical. I had to work with a commercial grower growing the vegetables, and his whole issue was he waited too late to stake and weed. Stake and weed is nothing more than I have these stakes, and as that plant's here, I weave around that plant to give it support, and when it grows here, I weave around that plant and give it support. If I don't stay steady with that tomato plant, because it doesn't have the stability to stay upright on its own, will lay over. But then this stem is getting larger, and holding it upright, I could break it off. A lot of bad things can happen. Well, this grower got behind, and his tomato plants are on the ground, and he was wanting to stake and weave. So he knew he wasn't going to keep beating them all off the ground. So my job for him was to find a straw blower to get a mat of straw underneath that tomato plant, which is where mulches can help you with disease control when you grow stuff. You can put straw down there, another mulch to give that barrier. Then that is going to help you keep the plant dry and not be against the soil. So he's asking me to do almost a impossible task because the turf industry's gone away from grinding straw bales and blowing that out to where it's all one process. They have this media that has a seed and fertilizer in it, and they blow that out. It's more efficient on their time. But I did find them a place where you could buy from a lawn care industry an old version that was a straw grinder, so I could put straw down. All because he didn't do job number one. Stake and weave when the plant was small and keep it upright and don't stress that plant out. And the other thing that can happen is bacterial disease can move in. And that's where we do have things that can protect our plants that are organically approved, which is that Bordeaux mixture, which is copper and sulfur together to give it a barrier on that leaf that prevents that spore from getting established. But anytime we use a contact fungicide, we have to remember that after every rain, we got to spray it again, you know, because it washes off. So we have more modern fungicide that actually moves into the tissue a little bit and will stop a new fungal infection and give it longer protection. You know, so that's where we have to make that balanced choice. Do I go and be organic and protect it? Do I do what I told my organic grower to do with his vegetables is when he sees a disease cucurbit, you yank it out before it spreads it to another cucurbit and stop it that way, you know, and try and manage disease through eliminating that tissue. He got copper approved, so he's been using that, but that's still, you know, and you can organically control insects that are easy to, you know, man has got more energy than I do. He goes around with his Colorado potato beetles, his potatoes with a can, and he's picking them off and putting them in there. Because even if you're using BT, once it gets to the second instar, it doesn't work anymore. So the only way, once it, you know, if it gets ahead of you, you can control it organic way, is by picking them off. Because you don't want to use a lot of good control measures after that.
That's what people I've read too about Japanese beetles going out, just plucking them off, but that's.
You do it when you see the first one. No, actually, that's the easiest one of all. Now, what you do is you get a Christmas list. And then any neighbor that's like 1 mile away from you, that's an avid gardener, you give them that bag in the bug as a gift. And then they'll go to their yard and that's their perspective. Yeah, because that's what draws them. And that's why, you know, that's one insect you want to control early because it's releasing that hormone if it's feeding on your stuff. And it's not just what shows up there, they're attracting them in. So like if I have a grape arbor and I went to Michigan State's, student campus, which was organic. And overall, it looked pretty good. They did this high tunnel with and then inside the high tunnel, just like I used to shade mom plants, get them in that greenhouse I worked at, get them bloom when we wanted to harvest them. They use plastic to go over in the winter time to extend the growing season. And then they use compost to keep that growing area fresh, and they rotate crops within there. But I looked at their grape arbor and it looked horrible. So whatever control they had for Japanese beetles didn't work that year, and they covered them, and I think they got their crop, so they weren't disappointed. So that's the other balance, and deciding how you manage your pest is what damage are you willing to pay? My threshold level is different than anybody else's in this room, and you got to decide what your threshold level is. They used organic producers of sweet corn used to use the earworm feeding as an advertisement. If they like it, you should too. Realizing they weren't going to control it, but we've come up with new tools organically, or doing a better job organically in our system to reduce that. Apples is a good example. Originally it was hard to produce an apple crop organically that didn't have issues with the apples. And now we're doing a much higher percent of them looking good by following the protocols using the organic options. It's not as easy, because anything we do organically is not going to be as long lasted. And some definitions can be problematic, because the best way to control disease in any crop is resistance in the plant that we develop. And some resistance developed, the organic industry may not recognize as being appropriate. So it's those hurdles too that we have to work through.
You mentioned straw as a good mulch to protect. What about grass clippings? Are those any good?
They break down rapidly, one issue, and we always say we've got to make sure we don't use any herbicides on our lawn. It's more the issue that they break down fairly rapidly, and you don't want to use a big pile because they produce heat.
Mm-hmm.
I had someone that took a bunch of grass clippings and they put them around the base of the tree, and it didn't kill the tree. It came this close from killing it because it produced so much heat in that cambium layer, it shut down water flow to the leaves, and all the leaves dried out. So they came close to killing the tree, but it did bounce back. They were lucky. The heat dropped off just quick enough before the damage was permanent. So when we're using grass clippings, limitations are yes, that's not a problem. We don't want a pile close up against plants because of the heat it puts off, and realize that's a temporary situation where it's going to work because it's going to break down rapidly and not be shading our soil so they don't produce new seedlings.
That's great in your compost pile.
Do what?
It's great in your compost pile.
It works great in your compost pile because we're always looking for greens and to go with the leaves that we can store back for a compost pile from the fall. And better yet, it's best that those grass clippings go back to the turf and supply that phosphorus and potassium and recycle those. So that the only nutrient we need to supply then is nitrogen really for a lawn. That's why lawn fertilizer bags aren't big in phosphorus and aren't big in potassium. Because we're counting on people that allow those clippings to go back and refeed that turf. So that we just have to worry about nitrogen, how we want something like that. Some would say it's not the best one to use in your compost pile, but it is a great source of nitrogen, and it's those compost piles need to be 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, because nitrogen is what feeds the microbes that break down the carbohydrates. So when it's like wood, 140 to 1, it goes very slowly.
One more question. This is kind of revisit something again, but when I look at my basil plants, the leaves have holes and the kale has holes, and I look around, there's nothing left there. Whatever was eating on it is gone. Do they leave anything behind other than a hole that's objectionable, or are they still perfectly safe and good to eat, or are they?
They're safe to eat. I mean, it's the grass we leave behind. It depends on the insect. Now, because some beetles will leave holes too as they're feeding, as adults, because it could be a larva from them. some insects don't hang out during the day. So a good time to go out is with your flashlight and night to see if anything are on the plants, because there's night feeders. Just like that. Sphinx moth flies at night, you'll never see that insect flying during the day, so many times it's a good time to just go and see if there's anything on your plants. If you're having leaf feeding, see if you can identify something. Yeah, so the main thing they leave behind is just, what they digest, as they're feeding. Their skins, if they're an insect that goes through, that kind of development, like leafhoppers leave behind skins if they're on your insect, so you have that telltale sign in there. If they're a sucking insect that will take away your nutrients and cause hopper burn by putting in a little chemical acid to you. So we are, we investigate our plants to see if there's anything that's of evidence. And fast-moving insects on your plants usually are the insects feeding on the pest insects, because most pest insects don't need to move fast, so they're feeding on a plant. But, there's a lot of insects that leave on plants, which usually that feed on fungus or other insects. So they're on there actually just cleaning up sources of food on there that have nothing to do with fruiting the plant. So it's a neutral relationship, or maybe a positive relationship with the plant. I mean, like ants, aphids to get the sugars out of them that they take back to the colony, for example. So, but then if it's a carpenter ant, it's just not milking the aphids, it's creating, hollowing out your wet parts of your tree. Meaning the tree is actually in decline if you have carpenter ants. They don't go feed on the healthy. So,
how do you get big stalks?
Asparagus? Do what now?
Tomatoes.
It's a balancing act on fertility on tomatoes. You don't want to over fertilize them with a nutrient like nitrogen, because you get too much vegetative growth. So that's why you want to know your fertility level of phosphorus potassium and kind of know where you're at there. Or like for potatoes. Does anyone have questions about potatoes?
What about the green? The turn green? They're still good to eat, or they're,
No, that's a good question. What makes them green doesn't hurt you. That's chlorophyll, because it's a stem tissue. It's stolen. This was there. Aren't you glad I didn't try to go through this whole PowerPoint tonight? Oh my gosh, it's making me crazy. So we have
the second button.
we have this chemical that forms in that area that it's a carcinogenic. So when we dig our potatoes, we don't want them in the sun or it forms. Or if potatoes that are on the soil edge, they'll turn green. So that's where straw or some mulch on top of that to keep them from getting sunlight is good, because you're wasting part of your potato. Because wherever it's green, you need to cut that part out before you eat that potato. And if it's old green, you toss it away. I mean, because it's concentrated in the part of the potato where it's green, that chemical. And we sure don't want to eat that, because you don't want to, we take in enough carcinogenic. We drive cars when we're doing it. We're in our homes, we're doing it. Everywhere we go. It's a battle between our bodies able to fight them before we, or we get, or if we overload our system. The real reason why Roundup is so negative, it's a minor one. So it's like, so we don't want to eat that, because it's one of these things that, so this is what causes you to get cancer. But it's all these little introductions into your life that allows it to happen. So it'd be one of those if you ate the green part of a potato. When you drive your car, you're getting one of those little dots. And when I'm living in my home, heating my home, I'm getting one of those little dots. So that's why we have to eat healthy and eat produce that has antioxidants in it so that we have our tools to fight it. That's a good question. Yeah, we do not want to eat what's green on our potatoes. And then to store them, we want to go through a period of 1 or 2 weeks where we're keeping them at about 65 to 70 degrees in total darkness. After we dig them, they need to be in dark. Then we put them in an environment of 40 to 45 degrees around a relative humidity of 90% to store them for 2 to 9 months. Titus Overholtzy's got potatoes left over from last growing season. He's selling at the farmer's market because he did such a good job of storing his potatoes. You know, and Norman Mullet, the organic grower that goes to Indianapolis in the wintertime, that's what he sells is like sweet potatoes and things he can store. But you got to store them at the right level, in darkness, at the right temperature, relative to humidity. So our ancient, like my great-grandparents, I'd say, I know my grandparents didn't. Maybe one did, briefly. You know, that's why they had those structures. I have an old publication where they actually took a barrel and buried it in the soil to put soil over it to store these kind of produce in it to keep it, you know, have the ground temperature is going to be around 50 degrees. It's going to heat it in the wintertime so it doesn't freeze. So I have enough of that to let the soil heat it in the wintertime and cool it in the summertime. And they have these small storage options that they utilize to maintain that temperature and humidity to store their produce long because they couldn't go to the grocery store like we do. So we got spoiled. We can go to the grocery store and buy potatoes every day of the week if we want to. There's a time for a little while longer, so that's, so that is a good question because no, you do not want to. And if you dig all your potatoes and leave them out in the sun long enough, they'll start turning green after you dig them, because that's live tissue. So we always want to keep our potatoes out in the sunlight.
Speaking of storing things, what about winter squash? What's the rule for storing winter squash so that they don't go bad?
Well, it's similar. You're putting them in an environment where they don't dry out and the temperature is lower. So you can, so if you have a place in your house that just tends to be cooler than your ambient temperature, or a refrigerator or something like that, that can help the storage life. But next week I'll go in, we have a publication, I'll talk a little bit about that next week. So pest management, one is always what? Identify what the pest is by observing. 2, knowing your plant that you're growing so that you provide it the fertility it needs, and you know what to look for, and you know how problematic it is. So if I'm growing peas, it's pretty cool because it is cool. So there's not many insects active when I plant my peas and start growing, because we have these nasty critters that can feed on the legume family that just aren't really that active in that cool weather. So I've reduced my insect load, and the diseases are active in different environments. So a disease is not always active, So for diseases, I've got this stool here. I need the host plant. I need the pest, and then I need the right environment for it to occur. So some diseases occur more in cool temperatures, some in warm temperatures, and some more in warmer temperatures. So that pea is growing at a time where it just does not have literally a lot of pests. So if you want to grow something organically, peas is a good option, because when it gets the right weather for it to have a lot of disease issues, the blooms are not fertile anymore, because it's that warmer weather. So extended temperatures at 75 degrees will make that pea flowers infertile. So I'm just waiting for my pods to harvest. So that plant doesn't have issue. A tomato plant. Why don't you just pick a plant that has more problems to deal with than I do? I don't know how we ever get a tomato off our tomato plant. We've got 3 or 4 bacterial diseases. We have viral disease that attack tomato plants. Then we have a plethora of fungal diseases that attack that plant. We have one fungal disease for every season. And then we have organisms that attack the root system and cause the plant to wilt. And then on top of that, we have insect feeders that attack it. We have leaf feeders, caterpillars that consume the leaves broadly. And then we have the insects that can do damage to the fruit, like the stink bug that may just visit it occasionally, but it's destroying our fruit every time it's doing it. So you need to put that plant in a good position, which is good air movement, good fertility, mulches to help underneath it to reduce the splashing of rainwater that's throwing up soil and stuff on that plot that can contain organisms in it. It needs to be a well-drained soil. Why are well-drained soils so important is because of the disease organisms that live in it. So whenever the roots are under poor environments, there's organisms that can infect the root system and get the plant unhealthy. So all of my vegetable research I did today, repeatedly, there's soil-borne organisms that can attack the root systems of many plants and make them weak. So that's why setting it up for success is the important part of having low pest levels. And then looking for the problems so we can address it. Because if you're paying attention and just checking for leaf feeding, you'll know if there's larvae on your tomato plant, and you can look for them then. And if you don't see them during the day, you come out at night and check it out. So you get your favorite wine you like to sip on, and you get up at midnight, sip on your wine, and go outside or after dusk and see what's happening. It doesn't have to be midnight, just after dusk. Because a lot of these insects are soft-bodied insects, so they like to come out after the weather cools off, if that makes sense. So they can, except for that Orient Asian garden beetle, the beetle, it could be out during the day, just wimpy, it just hides during the day. It comes out at night. So just seeing what is doing the damage can help you, or taking action if the feeding damage shoots you towards an insect. And then if it's a disease, an infected leaf is not a healthy leaf, it's going to die anyways. Why not get it off the plant? I mean, if it's all the leaves, you may not want to take it. You may just want to leave it so they can finish ripening what fruit it has before you take it. It's doing the control. Back to the asparagus, there's leaf disease on it. There's leaf diseases that get on rhubarb. So you want to remove all that in the fall of the year after the plant is done doing the building of carbohydrates in the plant. You get that out of there. Boisterous blight is common in flower plants. There's a lot of vegetables that can get that leaf disease too. So that's why cleaning up your garden space at the end of the year is important to get that stuff out of there and compost it. Like I told Norman Wallet, I said, if you gotta yank out one of your cucurbits because it's disease, you don't yank it out and leave it there. You don't yank it out and leave it close to your space. You put it into a compost pile on the other side of your property where it's not going to reinvest. If you're making that commitment, you get rid of it. And then that compost there, unless I do good composting, it's not going back to that garden space because it could still be there. And that's getting the compost up to 140 to 150 degrees. So you actually kill what's living in the compost. So if I'm not doing good composting, if you're not like, my favorite story is my son. I had sheep and I had the bedding and the manure and stuff. And It's like, late into the winter in southern Indiana, he went out with my wife and he saw the steam coming off my pile. And he goes, Mom, that's hot shit. And he was right, that was stuff you could go right back into the garden space with. So you want to just think about your circle of things, how it biologically it's decomposing and how it's being transformed and if it's safe to go back into that garden space. So like disease things and things with weed seed should not go back in unless it's properly heated. It can go on the lawn someplace away from the garden space to use it there. So you can still cycle the nutrients. So we want to clean that stuff out in the fall of the year. Plant some cover crops to get actively growing organic matter down into that soil for soil health, if possible, if it makes sense. Or have other compost that you always can work back in there or other organic matter. So just think how you're going to build your soil where you're gardening. Because my publication kept saying, if you have more than 3% organic matter, that was our cutoff. So you always want to make sure you give a little starter fertilizer a lot of times to get things off to a good start. But the side dressing with nitrogen can be alleviated if you have an actively biological system that's releasing organic matter is releasing nitrogen back to the plants. If you get the organic matter high enough, you can skip side dressing on some of the crops that require it if you're growing in sand. So how many of you are growing in sand? You guys still need to do some side dressing because it's hard to get your organic matter high enough so that your biology in your soil is going to release enough nitrogen. Or I talk about heavy feeders. Even in a 3% organic matter, if I just had the previous crop being sweet corn and now I'm growing another crop, I may need to side dress it because I had a heavy feeder in that space and I didn't replenish it with a legume or just letting it sit idly. So if you only have a small space to grow vegetables, in that space, I at least rotate annually what I grew in that space. I wouldn't just grow, tomatoes you can do in containers. There's a lot of ways you can grow tomatoes to keep things not being a problem. But so your second garden could be a container that you grow up tomato here this year, and then next year you grow back in that small garden space, or you have a garden space that's small but divided up to where it's on this side this year and on that side next year, and then in my container garden the next year. So you can move things around, and active compost can help keep things alive and vibrant. So you don't have to have a big space, but you can't just grow like that grower did with his high tunnel tomatoes every year in the same space. Because eventually, if you're not renewing that soil, there could be an organism that comes into that soil that's going to kill your plant and wilt it. Because tomatoes have that too. Cucurbits are the same way. We
What
have
is that? You've said that several times.
a fusarium organism that can live in your soil. Where there's some wilt is an organism that can be in your soil that will take out tomatoes too, can take out your tree too. But there's a fusarium organism that can cause wilt in some vegetable plants. So there's plants that are susceptible to it and some aren't. So that's studying to know what plants are susceptible to what diseases. So I'll refine my handout for next week to hit those kind of bullet points and not bore you to death with a whole presentation. It'll take 3 hours. I've left over 90 slides. There's no way I can do that in an hour.
What do you do with the sandy soil that used to be underneath the swimming pool? Therefore,
The sandy soil underneath the swimming pool is a cool soil to grow stuff in because it has initially some good drainage, depending on what's underneath that sandy soil, because it's only like that deep, isn't it?
it's a little deeper. That's probably 2 to 3 feet.
2 to 3 feet. Well, it's got good drainage. And any soil like that, you can build it back by just adding organic matter to it, whether it's working in or organic matter like compost. And you can buy what they call soil at Lowe's. It's actually compost. Or you can visit. I don't know. I need to do better research on what our cities are doing with their planters they pick up, because some do a good job of composting like Bowling Green. Some do a horrible job like Washington, Indiana did. It was still look like leaves when you got it. So it needed to be composted. So that could be a source of your compost, is just picking up that material, and you debate if it goes into a compost pile or into your beds. Because if it still looks like leaves, then it needs still to be composted before you use it. But that there's nothing wrong with it. It just isn't to a finished point, because compost should look like organic matter. I mean, not like plant matter, you know, it should be to the point where it's going easily work into the whatever bed you work it into, because it doesn't look like what it originally was at all. And some cities are just trying to get rid of that material because they can't go to the landfill with it. They can pay the landfill to take it and then they put it in their compost piles probably. That'd be expensive, just like Bowling Green, Western Kentucky did. They charged Bowling Green to take it, and you know, and they did a good job of composting it so they could sell it back. But that way I like, you know, organic matter, because you know, so we have active O and I want to say what process though is the best way to put it in our soil. You know, so this is not feeding our microorganisms in our soil. So in our farm fields where they do tillage every year and use fertilizers to feed the plants, what ends up, we have 1% organic matter that's mainly processed organic matter, not active organic matter. Now the crop residue that gets worked in is this, but to build this up to where it's a higher percent of the organic matter in the soil takes a little effort of keeping the biology going through, in their case, they tend to be cover crops and reduced tillage, because what happens is with organic matter that is put in an air environment and is broken down in residue length. That's like what Bowling Green did to those leaves. Because smaller particle size has plenty of air, it breaks down rapidly. If we use reduced tillage, it incorporates back into the soil slowly, so then it can build up. And then if you do like one farmer did, and feed earthworms with spring oats planted in the fall, they take it on down in their channels, so it gets incorporated in the soil, or the roots do. Crops have roots, that's organic matter, that's active. And cover crops have roots too that are actively growing in the soil, and that gives us that active organic matter. And then having cover crops in the spring of there has a side benefit, because as our soils come alive in the spring, if we don't have actively growing plants in it, what's released is not taken up. Does that make sense? So if the organic matter releases some nutrients, if we don't have something actively grown, that's lost. That's why cover crops, one tool they do is they recycle nutrients. And that's a benefit. So a lot of biology happens in agriculture. But pest management is knowing what you're fighting and how you're going to fight it. And anything you grow, you should know. So how are you going to deal with hornworms on tomato plants? You can use BP. I can use 7. I can pick them off, because that's my hobby. I like to do every morning. It's my hot cup of coffee. Look at my tomato plant as I'm getting away. Oh, there's another little one. So it's your method and system based on how many you grow.
Speaking of the worms and the tomato plants, years ago, when I first was starting again after I retired, I was reading that there was a plant, a flower called borage, that if you planted it around the tomatoes, it would keep the worms away.
That's kind of that companion gardening I'm talking about. Where you plant flowers because that attracts in beneficial insects. There's some plants that repel. Like I was talking about, onions do. So that science is still developing and what actually works. Beans planted with potato rows helps those Mexican bean beetles for the beans, and the cow beetles with potatoes. You know, and then
there's no magic plants that you can plant that would keep most of the bugs away out of there.
Well, it's evolving, you know, because the other things I could keep away is like if I grow sweet potatoes, my number one pest is not an insect, it's not a disease. It's a vole. Because they like to eat it. And then the sweet potatoes create this cover. Small rodents don't like being out in the open. They know there's things that fly up there, they can eat it. But if they can get underneath the lining of the sweet potatoes and eat the sweet potato, that's a great food source for them. So that's probably the number one pest of sweet potatoes, is creating a barrier around it that deters them from going to that safe haven to feed on the sweet potatoes, because they have to go in open areas to get there. So the person that had problems with it, he was growing a lot of sweet potatoes, and the only thing around the sweet potatoes was lawn. So that gave them cover to get to the sweet potatoes, and it was an ongoing problem. Visit another grower that had sweet potatoes in the middle of his garden, and there was nothing green growing right next to them. There's other vegetables, but they were more the upright vegetables that weren't giving cover. And he didn't have any issues with voles sitting on his sweet potatoes. And he had a big pasture by his property. He had voles, but they didn't want to cross that barrier to feed on the sweet potatoes. So, just thinking through what do you want to grow and the system you're going to use to eliminate that problem. Because trapping voles, I can trap them all day. All they do is breed and eat. That's not going to work. I mean, they have babies. So you got to think of the pest. Is it a vole? Is it an insect? Is it a disease? And with tomato plants, we have multiple ones, so we have to set that plant up for success as we're growing it, so that it has good air movement. It doesn't, and then we monitor for the insect pests as they're feeding, so we can address it early. And then we decide if we want to use a contact insecticide, an insecticide they can eat, go to not be organic and use some of the proven products that are on the market. That's a decision each grower has to make. And then be timely with the option. When that tomato plant is 2/3 done and the last third is already infected, you just don't see it yet. It's too late this year, so I always talk about next year. And that's just keeping that plant sturdy and healthy. And cabbage is just making sure we catch those lopers and those insects are feeding holes into it soon enough, because they're tight wrapped. So we can have a little activity before we take action, but we don't want to wait too long on those either. We want to have a nice head of cabbage stuff to harvest. You don't have to rip off a third of the leaves to get down to what hasn't been damaged, so that's paying attention early on and determining if it's something that can be controlled with a organic pesticide or whatever your options are. But it's doable, especially for gardeners, because you're on a smaller scale. It's just being timely. And the secret, investing in grows, don't do too much. I had a COVID-19. I had this person that called me, and he hadn't gardened in years, but now he's got time. So what does he do? He has this property that has a perennial grass that's been there for eons, and he's got to try and grow a vegetable crop on that. Number one is he did too much. He didn't call me first. Because quite honestly, if you mow it really close to the ground, and you take a big old tarp and put it down there early enough, you'll start killing that turf before you plant. You use other options. You just sprayed a herbicide once. Roundup, everyone, I don't care what you think about Roundup. The one thing it is not is a perfect herbicide. It does not kill perennial plants with one application, because all it does is starve the plant of benzene ring amino acids. So if I got a huge amount of stored carbohydrates, one application of it, you may make me sick, but I'm going to come back with a vengeance. So that's what he did. So by the time you got that planted, all that grass came back, and now anyone wants, what can I spray? Well, you got your vegetable planted into this jungle because you didn't think this through, and you could have done it organically just with a tarp. If you put a tarp up, try it once, but don't kill it all your turf, but just put it out there for 10 days and pick it up and see how healthy your grass is. It doesn't take long to kill something if you're depriving it of light and it gets heated up. So, You know, so it's, or he could have put down a plastic mulch and planted in that and controlled that turf. But he didn't, he just, and then he had too much. You know, if it was in a small area, he could have managed it with a hoe or something, but when you plant almost a commercial sized garden and all this coming, you can't do that mechanically either. So he didn't do his homework. He did too much, too quick, and then he had a bad result. And nobody wants a bad result. I don't want a bad result for anybody, but you gotta plan properly to have success. It's just that simple. I mean, Harold has got an orchard and he's learned by hard knocks, but I tell you what, he did his homework. He studied what to do. If he wouldn't have studied it all, I don't think you'd have a tree, would you?
No, I learn more every day.
I mean, but you did your homework before you started planting apple trees, you know, so, and he's got a nice little orchard going and he's got apples this year and we're gonna go out there and visit his property later this year, so it'll be an exciting time to see his success, but it was not success that was easy. He spent a lot of money and time to research his solutions before he had initial venture. And, so that's impressive. He did it the right way. This gardener did the worst thing possible, and I just wish he would call me before he had his failure. No one wants failure. So I challenge you to grow a tomato plant. Do it.
I'm going to get a couple of big pots. I'm going to grow a container tomato plant thing this year.
Yeah.
A couple big pots.
That's the best thing about, the best thing about it was the industry that's paying people to work there, that our pickle factory went out, they were supplying with food grade barrels we could use just for that. So that was a small loss to our community, and the big loss was the jobs for our community, of course.
I miss the fact that there are no old pickle barrels left anymore to get around here. And I don't think the recycle center has any more, but because I collect rainwater to the water in the garden. So
Especially if you live in town, that's a good thing to do.
Yeah, last year the year before, they were short when the purple plant went down, but then they had the kits and everything for sale this year. Oh, I'll have to check. They're giving away free trees and there's a really place you just go hang out for a couple minutes and talk.
I used to be on the board, the advisory board there. Mary Ann.
Marianne, yeah, I remember.
We talked also about getting a county compost or a city compost going, but it never got very far. There were a lot of people who thought it might be a good idea, but it needed a little bit more than people think.
And it went South Bend, has a lot of material and anyone can get it. So it's just I put it in the day.
Where was that? You were talking about trees?
Recycle depot on Walter Brock Drive, West Drive.
Well, we have different groups, if you want a free cover crop, WCD is free seed to do that. The goal, getting people to do a butterfly habitat. One that's a food plot for animals.
And then like 5-pound bags, so I got the pollinator mix, the food mix for deer, and I got the sunflower seeds. The 5-pound sunflower is pretty good amount for plants.
That's one thing I can't grow anymore in my garden, sunflower, because they get to just about the point now where they're starting to look beautiful, their yellow seeds are filling out, and the squirrels attack them. Just completely destroy them.
Yeah, and like on sweet corn, I list birds as past sweet corn, because if one decides to start eating on your sweet corn, you better get it out of the harvest. But then birds eat our cherries and eat a lot of our other Fuji apples. Do you like Fuji apples?
About a week before they were ripe.
Yeah.
30 or 40 of them all in like 2 or 3 days. Just peck holes about the size of the dime. But then that's.
But I planted potatoes in my garden in southern Indiana, in my eroded loam soil in the garden area. And there hadn't been a vegetable grown there for a few years. And then as soon as my potatoes got out of the ground, guess what was on them? Colorado potato beetles. They found them. You know, so just don't assume because it's a virgin planting in your mind that these stuff aren't gonna show up, because it's kind of like the field of dreams. You know,
I tried turnips one year and they were doing wonderfully, the most beautiful turnip greens you ever saw. And then I dug them up and they were all full of holes. I talked to Jan Perfect, and I said, how do you do it without it? She said, I sprinkle salt on top of it.
There's things that live in our soil, there's things called quick beetle larvae, which is a wild one. These are items like that, you know, and they can live in our soil for more than 1 year, so they're just foraging and there's and they'll, we always want to remember when we work in fresh organic matter, that's they start decomposing, and what that attracts is flies, and they can have maggots that get into your soil and start feeding on stuff in there as well. If they're not picky, I mean, but the decaying organic matter is good, your seed is good, or your potato piece is good, so sometimes it's best to have a little timing in between working in organic matter and planting a site. So it's just planting. We'll have warmer days before you can plant. So if you can do it in a timely fashion where you have some space, or that section you use a summer crop that you plant a little later, and then then you can avoid some of those problems. So literally, seed corn maggot has taken out entire crops when they've done that. Because they attract them. So timing is a big part. Pumpkin, if you don't want the virus, planting later helps with that. Early plant pumpkins tend to get more of the virus. So we can talk about this for days, I guess. Every plant's got its own unique pest issues.
We see coffee and
Well, there you go.
hang out with a couple hours, share stories.
We could. Because really, I'm selfish. I want to learn from you guys. I'm sure you have experiences that I can learn from as well. So.
I just started today, getting too old.
Well, it's just what's that saying is well, if you don't start today, you're just gonna be 1 day later.
And if you're busy, stay young.
Oh yeah.
Once you get sedentary,
I mean, Sister Mary Beard, if anyone proves that, it's her out at Mandarin. I mean, I just saw her last week and she looks younger than ever. I mean, and she broke her wrist because she fell over the previous year, so she was having some mild. You wouldn't know it now. She's back up.
Thank you.
Wow.
If you have beets that stay little, is that because of poor soil?
Well, it's crazy as it sounds, it's making sure it has all the nutrient it needs. Because if something's not growing, if a micronutrient is missing, it might as well just be a macronutrient. Well, we have to realize that soil nutrition is it's all the nutrients the plant needs to grow. So the hidden hunger is when a plant looks normal, but it's not thriving. And then if it really looks stunted, it's probably missing something it needs, so it's hard for, so what commercial growers do is they take plant samples and send it to a lab to find out what the nutrient profile of that plant is, and they can figure it out. As a homeowner, I would give your acid and apply micronutrients and see if that stimulates its growth. Because that has all peripheral micronutrients. Because it's for acid-loving plants that tend to be grown at the wrong pH. So it's giving boron, zinc, and all those micronutrients that could be missing. So I try fertilizing one with that and one not, and see if that one that I fertilize responds. Then I know a micronutrient is missing. So I do my own little test. to see if I have a micronutrient problem, so I can cross that.
And then
And if I'm organic, I won't eat that one, but at least I'll know there's a micronutrient problem.
And if you're, so even if you would have garlic in a certain spot in the garden, you should rotate that? Or is that okay?
Garlic is not as bad as some of the other ones because that's a full season crop that, because really what determines your garlic size is how much sun and warm weather we get in spring. You plant in the fall and harvest in the spring, so most of the time it's in a cool environment. So, but yeah, rotation there with occasionally will still be good, but it's not as problematic as some other crops if it's in a well-drained soil. They're always this week preference with winter crops, so it'd be a little bit. Yeah, your size of your garden, it really is the spring weather. If we have a lot of cloudy days and miserable spring weather, you're not gonna get a bigger garden.
Thank you.